Brad, this is a non-hand call, is that right?
Yeah, it's a non-hand call.
So what is your question?
Well, this came from, I think I emailed this in last week, and you released a video on one of the days about moving up in stakes.
Yep.
And basically, I think I emailed you that you basically named my situation verbatim. Like, I'm a 1-2 player and want to get to the $5 blind level as quickly as possible. And basically my questions were moving up in stakes, combating playing for a higher buy-in and dealing with the variance of it, and not being scared money and willing to go for it type of player still.
So are you willing to tell me where do you usually play out of around?
Sure. I play in the Chicago land area. There's a Four Winds casino and a Horseshoe casino that I basically play a 1-3 or 1-2 and 1-3 game, which is a $300 buy-in.
All right, $300 buy-in. And do they rake the game, meaning they take a percentage of the pot up to a certain amount?
Yeah, I think there's a $5 max or a 10% up to $5, and then there's a 2 different $1 drops for high hand and jackpot. So it's a 7 total.
Now, the thing about those high hand drops is that, you do get some of that money back overall, depending on what the room is. I mean, there's different laws in different places. I think in California, it was they could take a 40% administrative fee. But, I mean, I was down so much in bad beat jackpot drops, the 5-10, it was insane. But, the thinking goes that people say, well, I wouldn't want to have a bad beat jackpot drop or a high hand drop. And my actual thinking about that is, even if they were taking 50%, it probably evens out because of the type of players that those types of promotions bring in. Meaning, you're going to get 50% of the money back for those drops anyways, if not more. And then the game quality goes up. I've seen it because people are in there. I mean, people were talking about this at the Encore from last week. We barely got a 2-5 game off because a bunch of people were up at the Brook for a high hand promo. So that's kind of a wash. $5 actually at 1-2, even though it's a huge percent, a big, it's better than a flat drop of $7 or $8 in California. It's not quite as good as probably some of the time games, I would say, in Texas. But the thing that you have to understand, and I think it's important to, I can talk about this once every 3 months. The thing that you have to understand is that for the most part, in most rooms, the setup is the same, where the rake is pretty much the same across all of the levels, meaning that if you're playing in a 1-2 game and it's a 10% rake up to a $5 max, usually the 2-5 game is the same rake. And usually the game above that is the same rake. Sometimes the smallest game might be $1 less. Let's just assume that, like most rooms, it is the same. The amount of money that's taken out of every single pot is such a huge factor in your overall win rate, the lower stakes that you play, because there isn't that much money in play. I went over, it's a $300 buy-in. Plus, at the small stakes, usually, I don't know if you've encountered this, Brad, you probably see a disproportionate amount of we can call them ultra minimum stacks. You'll see quite a bit that people will buy in for the minimum at the lowest level, which then even makes the game harder to beat. And I hadn't talked about this on the flagship podcast this past week. I was in a weird situation at Encore where the game was probably unbeatable at 2-5 because there was me, at one point it was me and 5 other winning 5-10 rakes at the game. And this is at Encore where they were taking $10 or the 10% up to $10 in rake. And I did the math out. If they're taking on average, I even said 1 big blind per hand, and you're getting 30 big blinds, dealt per hand. They're taking 30 big blinds off of the table. The other 3 players that were not professionals, they would all cumulatively have to be winning losing 30 big blinds an hour for us to even break even, all things being considered. And then if you talk about us having average win rates of 6 to 8 big blinds, you can see that the game was probably unbeatable with that particular setup because there were so many winning players. Now, you're not going to run into winning players at the lowest level, but because you're actually having 2.5 big blinds taken per hand, So now you're talking about at 1-2, if it's like, I know it's, let's call it 2, because I know it's a rake, right? So it could be less, but let's say it's $4. So now you're having 60 big blinds being taken off of your 1-2 game. 60 big blinds, which means that even if you're like the only other winning player, in all things being considered, for you to break even to overcome that, like the other 8 players have to be losing 60 big blinds for you to even necessarily like break even, because the money has already been taken off the table. That's to make it like neutral. You know what I'm saying? That would be like seven or 8 big blinds per player per hour. And, you know, when you're dealing with people who are very, very short, they can't lose that much, right? So what I've always said is that this is why it's a race to the $5 blind level, and sometimes a race to 1-3, depending on the setup, is I don't doubt that you can beat these ultra small games for maybe like a few blinds per hour, a few dollars per hour, but you're never going to be able to build a bankroll with that type of win rate. And you tend to develop some pretty bad habits, I think, in those games, because it becomes correct to sometimes play backwards because you never really have to worry about building a pot up. So I strongly encourage all of my CLP subscribers to try to at least play in the next level up and get your feet wet and get acclimated to the game. And I think the easiest thing that you can do is just buy in for the minimum at the next level. So if you're playing like 1-2 and it's like a $300 buy-in and you buy in for the max at like 300, usually like the next step up at 2.5 or whatever it is usually like a $300 minimum. I mean, it's not always like that, but you'd be surprised that usually like the max buy-in at that level below is now the min buy-in at the next level above. And if you actually get into very, very splashy 2.5 games, you can absolutely print as a short stack because people can't call your raises, and they are. And you can do like a lot of reshipping, and your stack is very, very small. So you can make a lot of pre-flop mistakes against you and other types of mistakes as well. Now, it is certainly boring as hell. Like you probably need to play like less than 10% of your hands. But to be honest with you, if you're a winning player at 1-2 with that rake, you're probably playing that tight anyways. But I think a lot of people need like the mental sort of confidence and nudge to just go up to the next level. It's not necessarily costing you anything more in terms of a buy-in, right? If you're buying in for the minimum. Now, is there additional, I guess you could call variance in like losing stacks? Like if you say, hey, I'm going to call a stack $300. Whether I buy in for it at 1-2 or I buy in for it at 2.5, will you go up or down more stacks at 2.5? Certainly you will, because there isn't necessarily a lot of play. But, you know, if it's something that you strive for where you're trying to profit from poker, like as a semi-pro, as I talked about on the podcast recently, or like it's a fun hobby that you like to play games and you'd like to make some money at it, a couple thousand, you know, maybe a few $1,000s a month, you have to understand that you're gonna have to get to that level anyways to do that, if that is what your goal is. So the sooner you can get mentally comfortable with that and with that level, the better it is overall. And this is a way to sort of mitigate the possible, you know, maybe your back is up against the wall because your quote unquote poker bankroll might be small. Now, what I also brought out, I don't know if this necessarily applies to you, Brad, is that if you're somebody that's just learning the game and you have a job and you can replenish your bankroll through outside sources, like through your job, there is absolutely nothing wrong with looking at it like it's all one. We're not thinking about bankroll rules because the goal is to get to this level so that you can actually start making a profit. You're not a professional poker player. You don't have to have living expenses saved up. You don't have to have buy-in rules, steadfast buy-in rules they have to play for. So you can just jump over all that bullshit if you can replenish your bankroll and know that, hey, I have to be at this level if I want to do this for a semi-part-time gig. So I'm not going to grind it out at 1-2 and build a bankroll up so that I can move up. The only time you do that is if you actually had no money at all and you actually had to do that, but that's usually not the case with most people. I don't know if that fits into where your situation is. Brad, is this more of a mental thing? Is it a financial thing?
It's less financial because I'm more of a weekend player. So I do have a 9 to 5. So I play on Friday, Saturday, Sunday mostly. But it's a little bit on the mental just for, I'd say I'm fighting like some of the downswings. If I lose like 3 to 6 buy-ins at 2-5 and I'm buying in for the max, then that just hurts. I feel like it would hurt my bankroll and my mental more.
If you're buying in for the max.
Yeah, that's a lot of what I was questioning. This past weekend, actually, I experimented with just going to the 2-5 table and buying in for 600 and kind of trying to play a solid game that way. Still a little bit tighter, but I wasn't sure if buying in for the max for the 1K cap and being able to play, 200 big blinds effective was a smart move right away.
How new are you to the game? Just like how long have you been playing for?
Been studying and playing since I think September will be like 2 years solid of tracking.
Okay, so this has nothing to do with you, in your case personally, Brad, but I would say that somebody who's only been playing for 2 years, you're not going to have some sort of exponentially larger win rate buying in for the max versus buying in for the minimum or like something in between that. And that is if you can play short well, like if you're disciplined enough to play short well. So when you're not giving up that much by not buying in for like 200 big blinds, and you can mitigate like that quote unquote variance with these like buy-in losses, then that's really your answer. I mean, I don't even know if you need to buy in for 600. I mean, it might be a case where, again, when I tell people like to get their feet wet, I say buy in for the minimum, and then you can sort of increase your buy-in as you move along. By the way, like how many other people, like when you bought in for the max, or when you're thinking about buying in for the max, how many other people at the table were at the max?
Actually, one of the nights when I bought in for 600, it was a slower night, and I covered a couple people, and I was surprised. But we were in the feeder game, so there's a must move sometimes at the casino I play in. So the other game was probably the good one, and I was sitting with the tighter people waiting to get to the better game. So I covered I was like a mid stack. I think a couple people bought in for the max.
I mean, one of the other things the reason why I ask you that question is one of the things that you can kind of put yourself in a reverse free roll, but you can put yourself, like for a guy like you with the amount of experience you have, you can sometimes actually hurt yourself by buying in for the max or buying in for a certain amount if the other people that have that amount are strong players and are not losing players. Because now you're not taking from the other stacks, you're just putting your stack at risk against the other players. So there is that finagling, I would say. But even if you're in a game where there are a lot of deep stacks, though, too, people would be very, very surprised at how like much money you can print and how poorly people play against short stacks. Now, it is slightly a different strategy. The other thing that I would ask is, what is the typical open size in the 2-5 game? Like, what are the people opening to?
Most of the time, it's 15 to 20, and then depending on how soft the game is with limpers, I know myself and a couple other good players that they tack on a 5 for every limper. So sometimes it can get up to 40. So it goes like 20 open, 40 open.
Right. But it starts with a 4x open, right?
Yeah, and a decent amount of time, and there's just straddles randomly. But $10 button straddles going on.
Like, I'm going to go so far as to say, now maybe it's not the minimum, but I'm going to go so far as to say is like, if you buy in for like 600, that's a really good example, right? That's like on paper, like that's 125 big blinds. But when people look at this and they kind of compare it to like online, that's kind of like 100 big blind buy-in. And the reason why is because I say that is because because of the larger open size, which is not, then people aren't opening like 2.5x. Like the average SPR post flop sort of approaches the same thing at that level. So, like, I don't know. And again, for someone who's only played like 2 years, and then if there's not necessarily like a lot of bad players that are always sitting with the maximum, your win rate could be very plausibly the same at 600 than it is for buying in for the maximum. Like exactly the same. Like you're not gaining anything by buying in for more. And again, I can say that like, I still don't think that you have to buy in for 600. I think it really it's a very large factor, I think, of confidence and what your goal is in poker. And if your goal is, hey, I want to profit from this game, like it kind of as a fun hobby, semi-recreational player, I know then you should get into your head that I know I need to be at this level. And as long as I'm comfortable with the live aspects of poker, I don't really need to waste a whole lot of time at an unbeatable level, especially if I can mitigate that by buying in for less at this level that I know that I'm supposed to be at or that I need to be at to turn the type of profit that I need to make.
Sure. And I think that was one of the final things I had in my email is knowing if your game is good enough, because at the 1-2, 1-3 stakes, especially around me, it's a softer game. So I'm usually the more aggressive. I play, the tight aggressive, the more aggressive player, which I feel like wouldn't be the case if I'm shorter and at the 2-5 game, because I'd have to play even tighter. But knowing that your game is solid enough that you can beat the player sitting there.
The only thing I would say about that, Brad, and again, I mean, I haven't played a lot of 1-2, although sometimes occasionally while I'm waiting, right, at Encore, from my experience, you are not winning money down at those micro levels by being like aggressive and getting people to fold hands. The way to win at those levels is by knowing how to effectively get the most amount of money in with the best hand. And that in itself can be an art. I'm not talking about like, having the nuts and knowing like when to move all in. I'm talking about having top pair middle kicker and putting the extra bet in at the end, or even betting even down like thinner than that. Now, I'm not saying that there's no bluffing the lower stakes that you go, but like 90%, it's a very showdown oriented game. So I just want you to think about that, because whenever someone's saying like, oh, like I'm the most aggressive, I mean, I know you didn't say this, but I'm aggressive. Like I can't be as aggressive at 2-5 as I am in 1-2. My counter to that would be, you're not winning. The largest part of your win rate at those levels is not through aggression. So you shouldn't feel like that should be a hamper to moving up to the next level in a 9-handed game.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So I hope that helps, Brad.
Yeah, it helps a lot, Bart.
All right. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.